Hi, my name is Mike Beneduce. I'm the owner and winemaker Beneduce Vineyards, and today we're going to talk about sustainability and climate change in the wine industry. So one of my favorite quotes from Peter Liam, who's a world-renowned champagne expert, is, "If you don't believe in climate change, you're not a farmer." And I think that kind of speaks to just the sense that farmers really have this very deep connection to their land and to weather patterns. Much of what I do on a daily basis changes based on what the weather is for that day, which is probably not true for most people that work in an office. And so climate change really is something that affects farmers very directly, affects their day-to-day life, and also affects, what crops they're going to be planting for future generations if they expect one to take over their farm. So this first slide here, I remember seeing this first in college when I was studying grape growing, and it looks like a long-term thing, right? So you're looking at areas in 2000 that are suitable for wine grape production. And over 100 years, if climate change follows the trajectory that it currently is, you can see that shift. A lot of northern areas that never have been able to grow grapes will be able to, but also a lot of areas in the south or feel closer to the equator will not be suitable for wine grape production anymore. And these are areas that have traditionally grown grapes for thousands of years. Places like southern Italy and lots of southern Europe, Australia. And so what we're talking about is these sort of small shifts in climate patterns that happen over decades or centuries even, but their effect that they can have on a crop like wine grapes, which is highly sensitive, can really upend the entire industry. One of the things that we have to ask ourselves, I think, as wine growers today is, are the varieties that we're selecting and the grapes that we're planting today going to be suitable in 50 years? Or do we need to start thinking about, how climate change is going to affect what grapes are most suitable? When we think about sustainability, we think about three things. We call them the three pillars of sustainability: planet, people, and profits. I think planet is probably the most obvious, also probably the most misunderstood. The marketing gurus have really brainwashed us all as consumers into thinking that words like organic, biodynamic, natural are sort of these catch-all terms that, if you see that, that the product is automatically going to be good, it's going to be better for the planet, it's going to be better for your health. And that's not necessarily true. Organic, for example, is a USDA term. If it's USDA certified, it simply means that the chemicals used to grow that plant are naturally derived. Does not necessarily mean they're healthy. For example, in wine grape growing, copper sulfate, which is copper and sulfur, is the most predominantly used fungicide to grow grapes. They have to apply copper sulfide multiple times throughout the year generally. And copper, even though it's a naturally derived chemical, it's a heavy metal. And so those heavy metals in very small amounts accumulate in the soil and never leaves the soil once you spray it. And it becomes toxic. And so now these organic vineyards that have been spraying that for 100 years are literally dead. Their soil is dead. Nothing can grow there. That's still organic, but that's an example of, a time when organic is not necessarily better for the planet. The second P that we talk about is people. Obviously, we want things to be better for the people, both that work here on our farm and also the consumers that are drinking our wine. Are we making a product that's healthy? We want to make sure we're not using any additives that are going to cause allergens or reactions, or making true wines that are reflective of a place without sort of manipulating them. And on the employee side, I think that also includes creating a culture that fosters work-life balance. People that work on a farm are generally making that decision not to work in an office job or indoors, and can we sort of create a culture that allows them to do that, to work outdoors, but still be economically viable and still give them opportunities for growth and skill development. And so those are certainly some of the things we think about in terms of sustainability. And I think the third, and probably the one nobody ever wants to talk about, is profits. But to me, this makes a lot of sense. If your operation isn't economically viable, at least when it reaches a mature state, you're not going to last long enough to make an impact on the other pillars of sustainability. And if you're not profitable this year, you're probably going to have less options next year when you're making decisions about sustainable practices. So you start to sort of whittle down these opportunities for your business to make an impact. Healthy profits also allow you to invest further in making your business more efficient, donating to worthy organizations, so it really creates a lot of opportunities. So you have to think about economic sustainability when you're planning a sustainable winery, and I think business in general. Some of the things we do for sustainable growing practices, we're blessed on the East Coast to have a lot of natural rainfall, which can be sometimes beneficial, sometimes not, but it does allow us to do what's called dry farming. So dry farming is growing grapes, growing any crop without irrigation. Water is our most precious natural resource, and so really using less of it or using none of it in this case is a great way to lower our inputs for growing a crop. A lot of crops, especially grown in more arid climates like California, require tons of water. If you look at what it takes to grow an almond, it's something like a gallon of water per almond to grow these crops, and so that's not sustainable in the long run. We are going to run out of fresh water if we continue that path. So dry farming is really a benefit that we have here in East Coast viticulture or grape growing. We also use philosophies called integrated pest management. So this is sort of working with the balance of nature rather than working against it. This allows us to use things like beneficial insects or hormone disruption or biofungicides that basically strengthen the immune system of the plant rather than acting as a curative once we have the fungus or the disease. We also practice no-till farming. So once we plant those grapes, which can last a lifetime, basically 50 years or more, we're not tilling that soil again. So that's called no-till farming. When you're tilling the soil, like when you're planting corn or an annual crop that needs to be planted every year, you're really disrupting the life cycles that go on and on underneath the surface. You can't see those obviously, but they're very important for root development, for creating healthy plants. And by constantly tilling them every year, we're really disrupting that. You're killing all the microbiological activity that's going on under there. And so one of the benefits and the sustainable practices we can do here is called no-till agriculture. So that's once we plant a permanent cover crop on the floor of the vineyard and maintain that. And so that really allows that microbiological life to thrive underneath the soil, and it creates a really healthy root system for our plants. Inside the winery, obviously minimizing unnecessary inputs and winemaking additives like we talked about. That's one of our sustainable practices. We're a really small scale producer, so we have a lot of opportunities to do things on a trial basis that maybe some larger producers don't, which is always fun. But one of the things we've started using is a native mother yeast that we call it. So we did a native fermentation last year, which just means that we're not adding any yeast to the wine. We're allowing the ambient wild yeast population that live in the vineyard and on the farm take over the fermentation. And we had a really nice native fermentation. It smelled great. It really kind of stood out from all the other ones we did. And so we isolated that strain. We sent it to a lab and had them run it through a catalog of commercial yeast strains just to make sure that it wasn't a commercial strain that was sort of hanging out in our winery. And they did identify it as a true native strain. And so they froze that for us. And so now we're using it again this year in 2020 vintage and sort of calling that our mother strain. So we're really using the native microflora from our vineyard, the native yeast from our vineyard to use most of our fermentation. So I think that's a really cool thing. Again, it's less inputs and it's a little bit more true to the place, I think, that we're trying to create here. In terms of sanitization, we used to use chemicals, which are really common in the wine industry. So we would use like a high pH solution and then rinse it with a low pH solution when we were cleaning our equipment. And a couple years ago, we invested in an ozone generator. So an ozone generator basically takes clean water, it injects ozone into it, which it makes from pulling oxygen out of the air. Ozone kills everything that it comes in contact with within about 10 seconds, oxidizes them. And then that water, that ozonated water, breaks back down into fresh, clean water that you can drink and oxygen. So there are no waste products created. It uses a ton less water and also no chemicals. So that's a really cool thing that we've started doing in the last couple of years that has been super helpful, I think, for just minimizing our inputs in terms of winery. And one of the other things we're starting to do is trying to make some sellable products from what we would otherwise call waste. So this is stuff that would end up in the compost pile. So after we press skins or grapes, Generally, we would compost those and spread them out in the vineyard to really minimize our input on synthetic fertilizers, which we don't use here. But one of the things we've started to doing is sort of using those waste products to make secondary wine products. So we have a wine coming out called Acqua Pazza. And so this is made from a second pressing of grape skins that we then rehydrate with water. And it's basically a lower alcohol wine. We mix that with some local wildflower honey from a farm just down the road from us. And then we bottle that up. And the natural yeast that's in that wine re-ferments the honey, creates a little light spritz in the wine. And this ends up being like an 8% alcohol wine that's really crisp, refreshing. Acqua Pazza means crazy water. The Italians used to give this to their field workers because they didn't want to have, a full alcohol glass of wine while they were working, but they could have a little bit of this with lunch and still get back to work. So we're excited about some of these sort of secondary products that we're using. Very sustainable because they don't require really any additional inputs, but they maximize our outputs. Down to the consumer side of things with wine packaging. We just recently redesigned our entire wine packaging, and our number one goal is really to make it plastic free. So we've done away with capsules, which really are just an aesthetic thing. They're just there to provide a look for the wine. We really don't need those. I mean, it's just a waste. It's another thing you have to throw out every time you open a bottle of wine. So we've done away with those. We bottle all of our wine in glass, which is obviously recyclable. A lot of it is made from recycled glass. It is heavy, so our whole business model is to sell locally, which we'll get into in a bit. But transporting wine across countries and across oceans is very cumbersome and heavy, and really affects your carbon footprint. And so selling locally in a glass bottle is a way that we can sort of minimize that transportation cost and all the carbon emissions that come with that. Our labels are made from actually a new paper that they just came out with that utilizes 30% recycled grape skins. So they actually are making a fiber with the grape skins and sort of weaving it into this paper label. It's completely plastic free. It has a really cool natural organic feel. Every label is a little different because it's not so consistent. So we like that. It actually kind of changes in the sunlight, the color, which is a really beautiful thing. So we're excited for those. We're one of the first people in the world to use that paper. And then one of the last things we do is we switched almost everything to what's called a DM cork. So a DM cork is basically a cork taint free cork, which guarantees that any wine that you put in that bottle is not going to spoil. So in terms of sustainability, having a product that spoils is like the absolute worst thing, because now you're throwing something out that has had all of these inputs put into it, and those are all going to waste. And so making sure that you're putting a final product in a bottle that's going to be sellable, that's not going to have to get thrown out, is really important in terms of sustainability. Next up will be construction practices. So we really have this sort of holistic view here about sustainability. And if we're doing all these things in the vineyard and in the winery, we also should be working them into how we build our building. And so we invest heavily in insulation. Our tasting room is insulated with 85% recycled newspaper, and that really brings down our energy costs. We have a solar project coming, hopefully in 2022, to be able to create enough electricity to power our entire building here. And when we do building expansions and renovations, we really try to source some local materials. So here, our bathrooms are built out of local mushroom wood that we captured from a local mushroom farm, reclaimed wood. And also the stone wall you see is built from field stones that we took out of our vineyard when we were plowing new fields. Finally, we have this really think local, drink local philosophy here. So we've committed to using only foods that are grown within 30 miles of our farm. So we use all local cheese, local cured meats. We grow figs and edible flowers and all types of things in our garden that we use here in our tasting, and really selling locally. So we want to make sure that, we are creating a high quality product that is available really for our local consumers. We're not looking to ship all over the world. We're not looking to become a huge brand. We're small by design, and that allows us to really focus on creating a an excellent on-farm experience for our customers, and also providing them with a place that they can come, drink the wine where it's made, and sort of see the whole process. And I think they become a little bit more connected to the final product that way. And so that's sort of our tie-in here is, in terms of climate change, obviously we need to be thinking long-term about what that means for the industry. In the short term, what we can do to address that is, make our business as sustainable as possible. I'm around if you have any questions. I can be found at Mike at BeneduceVineyards.com, and I hope you guys enjoyed the talk.